I often replay that night in my head, like a recording that can't be erased. The headlights, the screech of metal, the silence after the impact, all of it tangled with the smell of cheap whiskey and his voice begging me to stay quiet. I knew that with one signature on the report, I was giving up my future, but back then it felt like love. Now I understand. I wasn't saving him. I was burying myself alive under a name that still sits in the system as guilty. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Rachel Miller. I was 33 years old and lived in Austin, Texas. I had worked as a registered nurse at a private orthopedic clinic for nearly 9 years. My life was quiet, deliberate, and filled with small, hard-earned comforts. I had a routine, a sense of order that made me feel safe. I liked my coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar cube, my scrubs color-coded by weekday, my apartment neat and still. I had no siblings, and my parents lived a few hours away, retired and traveling in their RV most of the year. My only roommate was my dog, Luna, a rescued gray pit bull who slept at the foot of my bed like a guardian. Each morning started before the sun. I liked those hours before the world woke up, the silence, the empty streets, the slow unfolding of light over the highway as I drove to the clinic. I knew the names of all my regular patients, their routines, their fears. I knew who needed an extra blanket during prep and who always asked for the same nurse. I took pride in being that nurse. I listened when doctors didn't. I remembered birthdays, medications, the names of children and grandchildren. I made people feel safe. That was my job. That was my life. I wasn't exciting. My friends joked that I lived like someone twice my age. Early nights, a freezer full of meal prep Tupperware, books instead of parties, routines instead of adventures. But I liked it that way. There was safety and structure, and after a chaotic childhood filled with custody battles and cross-country moves, I had vowed to build a life that wouldn't break under pressure. Every bill was paid on time. Every drawer was labeled. I never drank more than 1 glass of wine. I never sped on the highway. I never let myself get out of control. I met him in line at the pharmacy. He was standing in front of me, asking the clerk a question about his prescription, and I noticed the curve of his back, the way he leaned with familiarity, as if every space had already welcomed him. When he turned, he smiled like he knew me, though we had never met. His name was Andrew, and he was an architect. I later learned he had designed one of the newer medical buildings downtown, the one with all the glass and white angles, like a spaceship nestled into the skyline. Andrew was everything I wasn't. Charming, spontaneous, unpredictable. He laughed too loud, drove too fast, kissed me in public without caring who saw. At first, I kept my distance. Men like him didn't settle for women like me, orderly, cautious, practical. But he was patient, persistent, and funny in that dry, self-aware way that made me feel like we were in on a secret. He called me Sunrise because I always woke up early, and because, he said, I brought light into rooms without even trying. We moved in together 8 months after we met. It was fast, too fast by my usual standards, but with him, everything felt different. He brought color into my life, literally and figuratively. His clothes hung next to mine in the closet, a chaos of blues and reds next to my clinical whites and grays. His books stacked in haphazard towers beside my alphabetized shelves. He filled our home with music, movement, and the kind of mess that comes with living fully. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe I didn't need to control everything to be okay. We talked about marriage. He showed me a ring once, half joking, asking my ring size. We joked about kids, picked out names we'd probably never use. I let myself believe in it, not just the fantasy, but the real thing. I imagined a future with him that didn't feel like a ticking clock or a compromise. It felt like breathing, but it wasn't perfect. I noticed how much he drank, at first during dinners, then during lunches, then before breakfast on weekends. I noticed how he dismissed it, how he laughed it off when I asked if everything was okay. He always had a story, a reason, stress at work, deadlines, old habits. He said it wasn't a problem, and I believed him because I wanted to, because love, when it settles in your bones, makes you doubt the truths you don't want to face. There were moments, little red flags waving in the background, nights he didn't come home when he said he would, the way his hands shook sometimes before the first drink, the way he'd grow distant for days, then reappear with flowers and apologies. I kept telling myself it wasn't serious, that I could fix it, or that it would fix itself. I was used to helping people. I thought love worked the same way. I thought I could bandage whatever was broken between us, like I had done with so many fractured bones and torn ligaments in my patients. I didn't see it coming apart, or maybe I did, and chose not to look. Still, my life on paper looked good. We were stable. I was stable. My career was thriving, and I was being considered for a lead nursing supervisor position. I had savings, good credit, a clean record. I had never been in trouble a day in my life. I had built a world that felt impenetrable to chaos. The walls were high, the locks were firm, the foundation strong. And yet, all it took was one night to watch it fall. But I didn't know that yet. Not then. Not when I woke up that morning, made coffee, took Luna for a walk, and texted Andrew to see what time he'd be home. Not when I clocked in for my shift and reassured an anxious patient that everything would be okay. Not when I stood at the clinic window, watching the sky turn from peach to blue, feeling for a moment grateful for everything I had. I didn't know how close I stood to the edge of something that would change everything, and I didn't know that I would be the one to push myself over it. It started like any other Saturday night, too warm for October, the air heavy with leftover sun and the distant smell of barbecue drifting from someone's backyard. We were invited to a housewarming party in South Austin, some friends of Andrew's from his firm, people I barely knew but had smiled at enough times to feel obligated. I wore a navy blue dress I hadn't touched in over a year, added mascara for the first time in weeks. Andrew complimented me as we left the apartment, his voice light, the keys to his car swinging between his fingers like they weighed nothing. The house was packed with bodies and laughter. Inside, it smelled like cologne, beer, and perfume, all mixed together in an invisible haze. Music thumped through the walls. Andrew was the kind of person who came alive in crowds, telling stories, gesturing with his hands, holding a drink without ever seeming to sip it. People leaned in when he spoke. They always did. I stood beside him at first, like a silent shadow, nodding and smiling when I should. Eventually, I drifted to the kitchen and nursed a glass of white wine that turned lukewarm too fast. I didn't drink much. I never did. Years of night shifts, medical responsibility, and the gnawing fear of losing control had made sure of that. Andrew, on the other hand, never kept track. I watched him move from person to person, cup to cup, his voice growing louder, his laugh sharper. I caught his eyes across the room once, and he winked at me like everything was fine, like he wasn't already 3 drinks past the point of good judgment. It was close to midnight when we left. I offered to drive. He shook his head and said he was fine. I hesitated. Just a second, maybe 2. I told myself he looked steady, that it wasn't far, that we'd be home in 10 minutes. I didn't want to start a fight, not with all those people around, not with him in that state. I slipped into the passenger seat and buckled my seatbelt, silent and tense. The roads were dark, only occasional pools of yellow light from the street lamps breaking the blackness. The car smelled like bourbon and sweat. He was humming to himself, some half-remembered tune, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping against his thigh. I stared out the window, counting intersections, wishing we were already home. The world outside blurred past in shadows and streaks. And then it happened. I don't remember the details clearly, just pieces, shattered fragments like broken glass. A figure, a sound, the scream of brakes too late, a thud that echoed deep into my spine. The car jerked, metal shrieked against metal, and time folded in on itself. For one breathless moment, there was only silence, and then chaos. He stopped the car. We both got out. My legs felt disconnected from my body. I saw a man on the pavement, still and crumpled like a pile of laundry someone had dropped. There was blood. Not much, but enough. Andrew stood frozen, his hands on his head, mouth open but silent. I ran forward, my training taking over, checked for breath, for a pulse, for movement. But there was nothing. His eyes were open. That was the worst part. Open and empty, staring through me like I wasn't there. I turned back to Andrew. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, deflated, terrified. He kept saying something. I couldn't hear it, or maybe I didn't want to. He started pacing, muttering, panicking. I knew what was happening inside him, that spiral of fear and guilt. I'd seen it in ER patients, in overdose victims, in young kids brought in for DUI crashes. I knew how fast everything could fall apart. And then I heard the sirens. That sound broke something open inside me. I looked at him, my fiancé, the man I had loved with everything I had, and I saw the end of everything we'd built. His past record, the alcohol, the blood test that would follow. It would all lead to prison, suspension, ruin. And I thought about the future we had talked about, the house with the wraparound porch, the dog we wanted to adopt, the trips we'd never take. I thought about the way he smiled when he designed something new, and I thought irrationally about how I could still save it. It happened so quickly. One decision, as thin and sharp as a needle slipping beneath skin. I told him to get back in the car. I told him not to speak. I told him I would handle it. And when the officers arrived, when the floodlights turned the world white and blinding, I stood in front of the car. I told them I was the driver. I said it calmly, clearly. I said it because it felt like the only way to protect something I thought I couldn't live without. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I lied with the ease of someone who has spent her entire life keeping things in order, making pain go away. The questions came fast. Had I been drinking? No, just one glass. Did I see the pedestrian before the collision? No, he came out of nowhere. Was I sure I had been driving? Yes, I was sure. They believed me. Of course they did. A clean record, sober, cooperative. I played the role like I'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. Andrew sat in the shadows, silent, obedient, just like I asked. They took me in for a statement. My fingerprints were inked, my photo taken under the buzzing light of the precinct. I watched as my life became a case file. The nurse in me noted the coldness of the holding bench, the dryness in my throat, the beginning of the headache behind my eyes. The woman in me wanted to scream. They released me a few hours later, pending investigation. No arrest yet. The man who was hit had no ID on him, no one to call. He remained in a coma for 3 days before he died. The news barely mentioned it. A hit and run, then not a run. A suspect in custody. Quiet tragedy. I didn't sleep. I walked the apartment at night like a ghost, brushing my fingers along the walls, trying to remember what innocence felt like. Andrew stayed quiet. He made breakfast, kissed me on the forehead, thanked me too softly. He was a man given a second chance, and I was a woman who had handed hers away. There was no dramatic moment where I regretted it, no thunderclap of realization, just a slow, spreading numbness, a weight I carried in my lungs. I couldn't breathe the same anymore. Every sound outside made me flinch. Every knock at the door felt like judgment. I had crossed a line. I knew it. Not because I had lied to the police, but because I had betrayed myself. I had taken everything I believed in, truth, integrity, responsibility, and crushed it under the wheels of that car. And for what? For love? For fear? For a man who hadn't tried to stop me? The days blurred together. I went to work. I smiled. I took vitals and changed dressings and told patients they were healing. But inside, something had broken open. A place where guilt lived now, warm and breathing, like a second heart. No one saw it. No one knew. But I did. I had stepped over the line, and there was no going back. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It wasn't just the temperature of the holding cell, though the concrete bench beneath me had leached every ounce of warmth from my body. It was a different kind of cold, a bone-deep structural cold, the kind that doesn't just touch your skin, but settles in your blood, in your breath, in your thoughts. It told me that something fundamental had shifted, that I was no longer part of the world I once belonged to. The intake process was clinical and indifferent. Strip, bend, cough, open your mouth, lift your feet, raise your arms, hands behind your back. I complied with every order, my body moving automatically, as if disconnected from my mind. They took my clothes, my jewelry, even the hair tie on my wrist. In return, they gave me a uniform, orange, oversized, stiff with starch, and a pair of shoes with no laces. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply shut down. As a nurse, I had seen people disassociate in the face of trauma. I had watched patients recede into themselves, eyes vacant, voices flat. Now I understood it. That emptiness, that small locked room inside where nothing could touch you anymore. The facility was in rural Texas, miles from the city skyline I once passed every morning on my way to work. Surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, the prison looked more like a forgotten military base than a correctional institution. The sky above it stretched wide and colorless, the sun burning through clouds like a searchlight. There was no softness here, no shelter, just steel and cement and silence broken by sudden, jarring noise. My cell was a narrow rectangle with 2 bunks, a toilet without a lid, and a metal sink that sputtered lukewarm water. The mattress was thinner than my kitchen sponge. Everything smelled of bleach and old sweat, a cocktail of despair and sterilization. My cellmate, a woman in her 40s with eyes like polished stone, barely acknowledged me. She had the look of someone long resigned to this life. I didn't know her name for days. The first night, I didn't sleep. Every sound startled me. The clang of doors, the buzz of intercoms, the coughing from other cells, the occasional distant scream. My body ached from the cot, my stomach twisted with hunger and fear. I pressed my face into the scratchy pillow and counted seconds, trying to convince myself that this was temporary, that I would wake up, that someone would say there'd been a mistake. But no one did. Days had no shape in prison. Time moved in long, suffocating stretches, broken only by counts and meals and the occasional call for work duty. Mornings came early, the lights flickering on with the cruelty of an alarm that had no snooze button. Guards barked commands as though we were deaf. We lined up for breakfast, lukewarm grits, instant eggs, coffee that tasted like rust. Everything was rationed: food, privacy, dignity. The other inmates studied me, their eyes sharp with curiosity, suspicion, or boredom. Some asked what I was in for, others didn't care. I learned quickly that silence was safer than truth. No one wanted to hear about a nurse who claimed she took the fall for someone else. They wanted stories that bled, and I didn't have it in me to bleed aloud. There were rules no one explained, but everyone followed. Where to sit in the cafeteria, who cleaned the showers and when, what gesture meant respect and what meant provocation. I stepped wrong more than once and paid for it with glares, cold shoulders, and once a shove that knocked my tray to the ground. No one helped me pick it up. I did it slowly, feeling every eye on me, my face burning with humiliation. In the clinic, I tried to volunteer. It seemed like the only place I might find familiarity, a sense of purpose. But I wasn't trusted. My credentials meant nothing here. I was just another number in the system. My knowledge became a secret I carried in silence while I watched others struggle with coughs, infections, anxiety. I wanted to help. I didn't know how to ask. The worst part wasn't the violence, though it was there, sudden, unpredictable, sometimes just beneath the surface. It wasn't the cold food or the forced routine or the aching loneliness. It was the feeling of being erased. Out there, I had a name. I had a reputation, a career, a home. Here, I was an inmate, a set of digits. I became background noise in a place built to break people slowly. I no longer recognized my reflection in the scratched metal mirror above the sink. My hair was dull and pulled tight. My skin lost its glow. My eyes looked back at me like strangers. I thought often about the outside world, about my dog, Luna, who had likely been taken to a shelter, about my apartment, probably rented to someone new, about my patients, who must have heard something on the news, vague headlines, short reports, a mugshot. I wondered if they believed it, if they cared. I thought about Andrew less and less. He hadn't written, hadn't visited. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he believed the silence would protect both of us. Or maybe he had simply moved on, free to walk city streets while I measured my life in minutes between counts. But in truth, I couldn't blame him. I had made the choice. I had offered myself like a sacrificial lamb at the altar of love or fear or whatever I thought it was that night. And now I was living in the aftermath of that offering, a life stripped down to its rawest edges, a universe where nothing soft remained. There were moments, in the quiet hours just before morning, when I forgot where I was, when the stillness felt almost gentle and I could pretend for a heartbeat that I was home. But then the door would buzz, the lights would flicker, and the illusion would dissolve. Prison didn't just take away freedom. It took away the illusion that the world owed you kindness. It exposed everything: your fears, your regrets, your helplessness. It turned time into a punishment and silence into a sentence. And yet, within that other universe, I survived, not through strength, not through wisdom, but through surrender. I gave up the life I knew, the woman I had been, the hope that anyone would come to save me. I learned to exist in the in-between, the space where past and future meant nothing, and only the next breath mattered. That was prison, a different universe, ruled by different laws. And I was just beginning to understand its gravity. There came a moment when the days inside stopped being days at all. They blurred into one another, thick and indistinguishable, like watercolors left in the rain. I stopped counting mornings, stopped marking weeks on the inside of my notebook. There was no before and after anymore, only an endless repetition of the same waking, eating, waiting, sleeping. The clock in my cell had broken months ago, but I hadn't bothered to report it. I no longer needed to know what time it was. Every hour here was the same kind of empty. I had learned the rhythm of prison by then, the sounds that meant safety and the ones that meant danger. I knew which guards to avoid, which corridors to walk quickly, which corners of the yard belonged to which invisible kingdoms. The place had its own logic, its own gravity, pulling you inward until you forgot the rules of the outside world. I had adapted, as people do. My body remembered when to rise, when to eat, when to stay silent. My thoughts, once sharp, had grown dull, worn down by the constant grind of survival. Then came winter, the kind that crept in slowly, through cracks in the walls and through your bones. The heating system barely worked, and the thin blankets did little to fight the cold. The smell of damp clothes and unwashed bodies filled the air. It was during those months that I reached the lowest point of my sentence, the place where something inside me began to fracture beyond repair. There was a woman named Teresa who worked with me in the laundry room. She was small and wiry, with dark hair streaked silver and hands roughened by years of bleach. She didn't speak much, but she hummed when she folded sheets, low and steady, like she was reminding herself of a song she didn't want to forget. We shared the same shift, sorting uniforms and linens for hours each day. The work was monotonous, but it gave me something to focus on. Teresa became my anchor in that sea of sameness. We didn't talk about our cases, only about small things, the smell of the detergent, the sound of rain on the metal roof, the color of the sky through the narrow laundry window. One morning, Teresa didn't show up. I thought maybe she was sick, or maybe they'd moved her to a different detail. Later, during count, I learned she had been found in her cell before dawn. The rumor spread quickly, carried in whispers down the hallway. They said she had hung herself with a strip of torn bedsheet. They said she left no note. The guards didn't say much, only that there would be an investigation, which meant nothing. I didn't cry when I heard. I just felt a hollow space open inside me, as if a piece of the air had been taken away. I kept seeing her hands folding those sheets, her lips moving silently to that tune. I kept hearing her hum in the back of my mind long after the laundry room went quiet. I realized then that this place didn't kill you all at once. It drained you slowly until one day there was simply nothing left to drain. That night, I sat awake on the edge of my bunk, listening to the wind scrape against the window bars. I thought about the choices that had led me here. They no longer felt heroic or romantic or even logical. They were just choices. I had traded my life for someone else's, believing it meant something. But here, stripped of everything, it didn't feel noble anymore. It felt senseless, like bleeding out for a cause that had already forgotten your name. A week later, I received a letter from my mother. It was the first one in months. Her handwriting was shakier than I remembered, her sentences shorter. She told me she was getting older, that the world felt smaller without me. She said she still prayed for me every night, that she believed in redemption even when she didn't understand what I had done. Reading her words, I felt the kind of pain that burns quietly, the kind that doesn't explode but seeps into your veins. I wanted to write back, to explain, to confess, but I couldn't. What could I possibly say? That I wasn't who she thought I was? That her daughter was both a liar and a coward? The letter went unanswered. Soon after, I was moved to a different unit. The reason was never explained, though I suspected it had something to do with my good behavior. The new unit was smaller, quieter, but no less suffocating. I was assigned to kitchen duty, where the air was thick with steam and grease. The hours were long and brutal, but I preferred them that way. The exhaustion left no room for thought. One afternoon, a fight broke out behind the serving line. I didn't see how it started. One minute, two women were arguing over bread trays, and the next, trays were flying and fists were swinging. The guards rushed in, shouting, and I stood frozen with a ladle in my hand. Someone grabbed my arm and pulled me into the chaos. I fell, hitting the floor hard, the metal clanging beside me. When it was over, I was bleeding from a cut on my forehead. A guard yelled at me to get up, his voice sharp with disgust, as if I had chosen to fall. They locked us down for 2 days after that. The lights stayed on even at night, buzzing faintly, erasing the difference between waking and sleeping. I stared at the ceiling and realized how far I had fallen from the woman I once was. The nurse who had once saved lives now lived in a place where life was measured in survival. I had lost my profession, my name, my faith in fairness. There was no moral high ground here, no way to stand apart. We were all guilty of something, even if not the crimes we were sentenced for. The point of no return came quietly. It didn't announce itself. It arrived one morning as I was scrubbing the kitchen floors. The mop water was gray, the bucket heavy. My hands were raw from the disinfectant. A guard shouted at me to move faster, his voice cutting through the din of clattering pans. I looked up at him, at the walls, at the barred windows, and something inside me went still. It wasn't anger or despair or fear. It was acceptance, the understanding that there was no version of me waiting on the other side of this. The person I had been was gone. There would be no clean return, no erasing what had happened. Even if I walked out of these gates tomorrow, I would never be the same. That realization was strangely freeing, terrifying, but freeing. I stopped clinging to the idea of going back to who I was. Instead, I started to notice the smallest things: the sound of laughter 2 cells over, the sliver of pink sky at dawn, the warmth of dishwater on my hands. Small mercies, fleeting but real. I began to live inside them, like tiny worlds within the larger prison of my days. There was a saying I'd heard once: rock bottom teaches you things the mountaintop never will. I had always thought it was just something people said to make pain sound noble. But there, on that cold cement floor, I began to understand. Rock bottom wasn't a place you visited. It was a place you became, and once you arrived, there was no map back. Weeks passed, maybe months. The numbness deepened, but it was no longer hollow. It had shape, texture, a rhythm. I could feel the machinery of the prison moving around me, and I had become part of it, not resisting, not surrendering, just existing. The point of no return was not one dramatic event. It was the slow erosion of everything that made me who I was. The nurse, the fiancée, the daughter, the woman who believed that love could redeem anything. I was none of those things anymore. I was just another heartbeat in a place that didn't care if I stopped breathing. It happened slowly, like the thaw after a long and stubborn winter. I didn't wake up one morning feeling hopeful or reborn. It was quieter than that, almost imperceptible. Something inside me, buried deep beneath layers of numbness and regret, began to stir again. I didn't know what it was at first. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was the faintest echo of the woman I used to be. Whatever it was, it started with a single moment, a sound, a look, a heartbeat that reminded me I was still alive. It began in the library. It was the only place in the prison that felt remotely human. The walls were still gray, the air still stale, but the shelves, dusty, uneven, and half empty, held pieces of other worlds. I had walked past them for months without care, assuming I had lost the ability to read anything beyond my own thoughts. But one day, I picked up a worn copy of a nursing textbook, its spine cracked, its pages soft from too many hands. My fingers traced the words like they were relics from another lifetime. Dosages, procedures, anatomy charts. It was all so familiar, so painfully intimate. I sat down at one of the tables and read until the lights flickered off for count. That night, something shifted. It wasn't redemption or forgiveness. It wasn't even peace. It was purpose, the faint spark of it. For the first time in what felt like years, I remembered what it felt like to be useful, to know something that mattered. The next day, I asked if I could help in the infirmary. They said no. Then I asked again, and again. Eventually, someone relented, more out of irritation than compassion. I was allowed to clean instruments and restock shelves, nothing more. Still, I took it. It was a beginning. The infirmary was a small, sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and despair. The supplies were limited, the equipment outdated. The nurse on duty, a middle-aged woman named Caldwell, ran the place with mechanical efficiency. She barely acknowledged me at first, treating me as just another pair of hands. But I didn't mind. I worked silently, absorbing everything, reacquainting myself with the rhythms of care. Even the sound of a blood pressure cuff tightening around an arm made my chest ache with a mix of nostalgia and pain. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the infirmary became my refuge. In a place designed to erase identity, I found fragments of my own. I began assisting with minor wounds, scrapes, burns, infections. Nothing official, nothing that would earn me trust on paper, but enough to remind me of the language I once spoke fluently: healing, observation, empathy. The words lived in me again, awkwardly at first, then naturally, like muscles remembering their purpose after too long in stillness. There was a girl named Leah who came in often. She was young, barely 20, her wrists thin and marked with scars that told their own history. One morning, she came in with a fever and a cough, trembling with fear that it might be something worse. I sat with her while Caldwell filled out forms, and for the first time since my arrest, I reached for someone without hesitation. I pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, whispered that she'd be all right, even though I had no right to promise it. She looked at me with something like trust, and in that moment, I felt a flicker of warmth where everything had once been cold. It wasn't grand or transformative, but it was real. A thread of connection, the first in a long time. I began writing again, quietly, in a notebook I'd traded for cigarettes I never smoked. I didn't write about the accident or the trial. I wrote about the women around me, their hands, their voices, their exhaustion. I wrote about the way the light changed through the bars, the sound of rain against the roof, the smell of coffee on visiting days. I wrote because it made the world tangible again, because it reminded me there was more to existence than punishment. The words came slowly, unevenly, but they came. Some evenings, after work, I would sit near the small window in my cell and watch the sky. It was the only place in the facility where the horizon was visible. I started noticing colors again, the faint blush of dawn, the deep indigo before nightfall. I began to understand why people called it a tunnel, this life inside. Because even when you are trapped, light still finds a way to reach you, however faint. It slips through cracks, through mistakes, through shame. It doesn't rescue you, but it reminds you there is still something beyond the darkness. One day, a counselor visited the unit, asking for volunteers for a rehabilitation program, education, therapy, job training. Most women ignored her. I hesitated, then signed my name. It felt ridiculous at first, sitting in that classroom, answering questions about goals and accountability, about what we would do differently if we could start over. But as the sessions went on, I began to see the others not just as inmates, but as versions of myself, women who had made decisions out of love, fear, desperation, women who had been told their stories no longer mattered. We shared them anyway, quietly, cautiously, and in those moments, something fragile and vital began to bloom between us. Compassion, maybe, or forgiveness in its earliest form. The program allowed me to mentor newcomers, women arriving for the first time, wide-eyed and shaking, still in the shock of confinement. I told them how to navigate the system, how to survive the first month without breaking. I taught them when to speak and when silence was safer. And every time I did, I heard my own voice echo back, stronger than it had been before. I was not the same person who had entered this place, and yet I was beginning to meet her again. Someone who cared, someone who could still give. Near the end of that year, I received a letter from the family of the man who had died. I had stopped expecting correspondence of any kind, so when the guard handed me the envelope, I just stared at it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was elegant and steady. His mother wrote that she had prayed for peace for a long time, and that one day she had realized peace didn't come from hating anyone. She said she didn't know the truth of what happened, and maybe she never would, but she believed that remorse was its own punishment. She wrote that she hoped I would someday find forgiveness, not from her, but within myself. I read that letter 100 times. Each time, something inside me loosened, as if the tightness I had carried for years was beginning to unwind. I couldn't name what I felt. It wasn't absolution, not yet, but it was something close, the faintest hint of air after being underwater too long. The next morning, I went to the infirmary and worked until my back ached. I scrubbed, cleaned, bandaged, organized, anything to keep moving. At the end of the shift, when Caldwell nodded slightly in my direction, a rare acknowledgement, I felt something like pride. It wasn't the kind I used to know, tied to status or success. It was smaller, humbler, the kind that came from knowing you had survived another day without losing yourself entirely. Nights grew quieter after that. I stopped dreaming of my old life, the hospital corridors, the apartment, the plans that had once defined me, all faded into a distant blur. What mattered now was simpler: a clean bed, a shared laugh, a letter that reminded me forgiveness wasn't a myth. The world outside no longer seemed unreachable. It was still far, but no longer impossible. The light didn't flood in all at once. It came in glimmers, moments, reflections. It appeared in the kindness of a stranger, in the stillness of the yard at dawn, in the rhythm of my own breathing. I had spent so long in darkness that even a flicker was enough to guide me forward. And though I didn't know it then, that flicker would be the first step toward freedom, not the kind granted by gates or parole boards, but the kind that begins within, where no one else can see. The day I was released, the sun was too bright. It pierced through my eyes like glass, unforgiving and unfamiliar. I hadn't felt natural sunlight on my face without the interference of bars or chain-link fencing in years. It was supposed to feel liberating. People talked about that first breath of freedom like it was sacred, transformative, healing. But to me, it felt like stepping into a world I no longer recognized. They gave me a plastic bag with the belongings I'd arrived in, clothes that no longer fit, a cracked phone with a dead battery, a few crumpled receipts I didn't remember keeping. I changed in a sterile room with flickering lights and a mirror too scratched to reflect anything clearly. My reflection looked back like a stranger dressed in someone else's history. My hair had more gray now, my skin pale from years without real sun. My body was mine, but it carried the weight of time past, of hours survived. A caseworker handed me a pamphlet about re-entry programs and shelters. She told me to check in with parole within 72 hours. Her voice was brisk, almost kind. I nodded as if I understood everything, though every word she said sounded like a language I hadn't spoken in years. When the gates opened, I stepped out alone. No one waited for me. I had imagined this moment so many times. Someone smiling, holding a coat, a ride home, a quiet meal. But the only thing waiting was silence and the long road back to the bus stop. I walked slowly, unsteady in my own skin. Every noise startled me, the blast of a horn, the shuffle of footsteps behind me, the voices spilling from a nearby convenience store. Even the wind felt too loud. I didn't know where to look, how to move without being watched. In prison, every gesture had meaning, every step was measured. Out here, freedom was messy, unstructured, chaotic, and I was no longer built for chaos. I found a halfway house with chipped paint and barred windows, irony thick in the design. My roommate was a woman who spoke to herself in whispers and slept with the light on. The bed creaked when I shifted, and the mattress was softer than I was used to. That first night, I lay awake, listening to the hum of traffic and wondering why I felt more confined than I had behind the walls. At least in prison, I had understood the rules. Here, there were none, or rather, too many, unsaid, invisible, scattered like mines I hadn't yet learned to avoid. I tried to find work. I walked into diners and gas stations, thrift stores and warehouses, repeating the same sentence over and over. I'm looking for a job. They nodded, handed me forms, asked for identification. I gave them my name and saw the moment their eyes narrowed. That name now carried a record. That name no longer opened doors. It closed them, quietly and efficiently. Some didn't call back. Others said they'd filled the position. One manager told me he didn't hire those types and suggested I try a shelter instead. I began to lie again. I shortened my past, said I'd taken time off to care for a sick relative, claimed I'd lost my documentation in a flood. I trimmed the truth like overgrown hedges, reshaping it into something palatable. But the truth had roots, and they always found their way to the surface. Background checks, whispered rumors, questions I couldn't answer. Eventually, I stopped trying to pass. I found work cleaning offices after dark, scrubbing bathrooms that echoed with fluorescent loneliness. I preferred it that way. No customers, no questions, just the quiet rhythm of cloth against tile. Rebuilding my life wasn't a straight line. It was a maze with no map. I applied to have my nursing license reinstated, but the board denied me. My conviction disqualified me. I appealed. I waited. I hoped. But the silence that followed felt like another kind of sentence. Without my profession, I was a ghost of who I used to be. I knew things, how to treat wounds, how to comfort dying patients, how to bring down a fever, but none of it mattered anymore. I was no longer allowed to care in the way I once had. I visited my mother after a few weeks. Her hair was thinner, her hands more brittle. She cried when she opened the door, held me like I might vanish again. Her home smelled the same, lemon polish and old lace, but I no longer belonged there. I sat on her couch and drank sweet tea I couldn't taste. She asked gentle questions, avoided harder ones. We spoke like acquaintances pretending to be family. When I left, she pressed a $20 bill into my hand, as if money could stitch the years back together. I tried to reconnect with old friends, but most had drifted away. The ones who stayed did so with caution, their smiles brittle, their words measured. They didn't ask what really happened. I didn't offer. Some said they admired my strength. Others didn't say anything at all. I could see it in their eyes, the quiet calculation of distance, the question they were too polite to ask. Are you still the same? And the answer, of course, was no. I wasn't the same. I had been broken in too many places, rebuilt with pieces that no longer fit. My laugh was quieter, my silences longer. I flinched at loud noises. I hated locked doors. I distrusted kindness. I lived with a caution that never eased, like an animal returned to the wild who had forgotten how to run without scanning for predators. Freedom wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't peace. It was just another version of survival, with different walls and fewer explanations. But there were moments that made it bearable. A stranger holding a door, a child laughing on the bus, the feel of warm coffee in my hands on a cold morning, a letter from a woman I had mentored inside, telling me she was studying to be a paramedic. Small things, inconsequential on their own, but they anchored me. I rented a tiny room above a hardware store with a view of a parking lot and the faint hum of traffic all night. I bought a plant I didn't know the name of and watched it lean toward the window, searching for light. Some nights I would sit on the floor and write letters I never sent, to the man I had protected, to the mother of the man he'd killed, to the girl I had been before everything changed. I wrote them not for closure, but for witness, to say, I was here, I lived, I broke, I tried. Freedom was not a finish line. It was a daily decision to get up, to work, to breathe, to resist the urge to disappear, to believe against all logic that healing might be possible even for people like me, not all at once, not entirely, but in pieces, in gestures, in quiet persistence. Sometimes I passed by hospitals and felt the ache of what I'd lost. I imagined myself inside, scrubs, stethoscope, purpose. I imagined touching someone's shoulder and telling them they would be all right. And then I remembered that I had once said that to myself and believed it. That belief had cost me everything, but it had also carried me through. I never got back the life I once had, but I learned to build a different one. Slower, smaller, but honest. I made peace with silence. I grew comfortable in solitude. I forgave myself in fragments. And on the hardest days, I reminded myself of one truth. The world might never forget what I did, but it also couldn't erase who I still was beneath it. Even if freedom was just another kind of cage, at least in this one, I had the key.